1348 Ex Voto, right? The video game that has been making the rounds on social media for the past few months now after the developers made some controversial comments, right? Um, and the game, of course, has now largely been, well, has been released and has largely, from what we've seen so far, has not been a huge success. Hasn't not it hasn't been a success at all. Um, but as usual, on this channel, I do like to discuss not just the what, but also the why, right? And so I'm sure there are a lot of people who are just absolutely tearing this game apart. But I do want to sort of have a more meaningful discussion about what exactly this game is, and examine the why, right? Why is it we are playing this game as a woman, a lesbian knight in the 1300s? Why exactly are we playing this game? Or why does this game exist? And of course, the more direct answer is this is to circumvent the meal experience, right? This is a typical hero's journey, right? A traditional hero's journey story that has, you know, existed throughout all of human history. And this is their way of sort of circumventing that and, retelling it from a female perspective or through a female lens. So that is the broad strokes, surface level agenda here. It's to circumvent that male story of the hero's journey, and put a feminine spin on it. So I think a good way of examining this is to look at a lot of the feedback or responses to the game's failure, right? For those people who are coming out in defense of the game and why the game is performing poorly. Now, in large part, and this is the typical response or the immediate response that you typically get is that, people are people want the game to fail and they're boycotting the game, and that is why the game has largely not performed well. Now, if we strip away the tweets that sort of caused this firestorm for this game, and we look at the Steam reviews, which at this point are largely mixed because there are some technical challenges with the game itself, right? It's the typical Unreal Engine jank, and not the good kind of jank that you want. But even if you strip away the tweets and all the controversy, there's still some technical issues. The character models themselves look absolutely horrendous. Even if you remove and strip away all of that, there are technical problems with the game itself. Now, if we look at the controversy and what the game has presented to us, which is again a woman in the 1300s, which obviously a knight in the 1300s would not be a woman. Would not be physically possible for her to wear that armor and perform these roles. Secondly, a gay man or woman in that era, depending on where you were, you would most likely find yourself at the bottom of a ditch. So there's just a lot wrong with all the elements of this game that is attempting to sort of tell. And occasionally you will get the argument that this game is inspired by Joan of Arc. Whenever people do pull out this card, this Joan of Arc card, it's a good indication that they're simply regurgitating talking points without understanding the history of it. First off, Joan of Arc was not a knight. So to use this as some sort of reference point, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. She was not a knight. Secondly, she never engaged in combat, and that's what this game is about. It is about combat. But she was not a knight. She didn't engage in combat. She was a part of, or considered a part of the army, but so was the bannermen, or flag bearers, or the men blowing the trumpets to, you know, before the march, or the men clearing the bodies from the field after a battle. The blacksmith, yeah, just saying that, okay, this person is considered a part of the army. It does not mean that they were a knight. They were, they were warriors or engaged in combat. This is the revisionist history that always comes up every time the usual suspects want to make uh, an argument that conflicts with historical fact. And we've discussed here on the channel a few times one of the problems that we run into whenever we try to tell distinctly male stories from a female perspective, right? And why it doesn't work, right? When it comes to matches of honor and bravery, these are largely within the male domain. Women do not or cannot perceive things like honor and bravery. They can't. Nature has equipment to the extent where they are capable of going out to face danger and managing to survive the encounter after overcoming fears, to be brave, making sacrifices for honor, then returning to tell the tale. This is a uniquely male experience, and it's not a matter of the era that you are in, because we can fast forward to modern times, to today, and the idea still holds true. It is still men who are expected to run into a burning building to save the occupants. There have been a number of mass shootings over the course of the past year, and in some instances, there were people around that rushed the shooter to try to grapple the weapon from them or save lives. And those have 100% all been men. So when we're discussing things like honor and bravery that are within the DNA of these heroic journeys, it is truly a uniquely male perspective. Whenever you do have a woman trying to tell that story, this is unfortunately the outcome that you get. And it's interesting looking at the story. I played the demo, not the full game, because the demo was as much as I could bear. But one of the things I noticed, or one of the first things I noticed, was while we have spent the last decade or two stripping away this idea that women are damsels or that men should be saving women, we've largely removed that, right? In the gaming industry, we've just removed the men entirely so that the men aren't saving women. But somehow, and in film and TV, the women just save themselves, right? If you think back to the recent Mario um, movie adaptation, Princess Peach saves herself, right? And this character, Mario, whose entire identity is built around saving the princess, could not save the princess in his own movie. And we saw it in the recent Predator film as well. Tron, same thing. And I guarantee you will see this in Zelda, in the upcoming Zelda adaptation as well. So it's interesting that this, the knight rescuing the damsel has been stripped away from a lot of male stories. But then in this game, apparently it's completely acceptable Once it's a woman pretending to be a man, then it's perfectly fine for the woman to be a damsel. And then I found it even funnier further into the game. They couldn't even commit to it 100%. That was funny because with the first time you try to rescue Bianca, she says that no, don't rescue me now. She has to tell you when to rescue her, to give this idea that, she has agency in this situation. That's what they're grappling with. All right. We need a damsel, but we can't make her fully a damsel. She has to have some control over the situation. And and so she tells you to rescue her later at this particular location. It's really just really absurd to watch. It's comical. It's almost comical. So the entire purpose of these stories is to circumvent that male those male heroic journey stories that have largely served us well, right? Those lessons are why we have existed as a species and have survived as a species. And one of the other interesting counters I often hear, and strangely, this tends to come from, the chuds, or some of them, or people who consider themselves to be chuds, um, or the real gamers, or even conservatives to some extent, right? It's the argument that it's fine if we allow these stories to be told, right? We just ignore them and allow them to tell their stories. And that to me is a good indication that you've embraced the that progressive propaganda, so to speak, because that tells me that you don't care about the art, you don't care about these stories, and you don't recognize the danger of what you've just said. I often say on this channel, again, it's the motto of the channel, stories are stories influence the culture, and the culture is a reflection of our stories. Now, if that holds true, if stories influence the culture and we allow these particular stories that revise history, and in instances erase history, if we allow these stories to become the norm, what does that then do to the culture, right? And we do know stories do influence the culture. That is that is not disputable. Here we are, centuries later, still pulling from great literature that existed, countless centuries ago. So we can recognize that there is some importance in the stories, and remaining, keeping true to those stories, and treating them with the reverence that they really should, or that they deserve. So these stories, like this video game, and even the example that I just gave earlier regarding Joan of Arc, right? You can see that playing out in real time, where they're rewriting history to then tell a different story than what actually took place, by saying she was a knight, by saying she was this great warrior. And so if you allow these stories to permeate, then that will damage your culture. And from the business side of things, it's even more bleak, because let's say a group of men come together after this game and they want to tell a similar story within this same genre, and they come together to make this game. They're going to have a much harder time now to get the funding for it, because when investors look at the landscape and they've seen the response to games like this, they're not going to be examining the elements that really made Ex Voto fail, all they'll see is that there was an attempt to make this game and it didn't work. And so the next group that comes in, which are, the, the next group of male developers, which is how these games became popular in the first place. But when they come in now to try to get funding for their game, it's going to be much harder because investors have already tried with this person, with this group of developers, and they've failed. So either it will be much harder for this new team to make that game, or they will need to check a lot more boxes. And this is one of the things that people just don't seem to understand when it comes to video game development, or rather, allowing corporations to lead game development, because it quickly becomes a revolving door of problems. A lot of these developers now trying to have a game made, they will have to adhere to these boxes being checked because the studio now looks at it as a greater risk. So even though from our perspective, we've seen the damage being done by relying solely on identity politics and DEI, we've seen it. But in order for the studio to be confident in greenlighting a lot of these projects, they are now going to make a list that needs to be checked to say, okay, we need to capture as many of the audience as possible. And so you must check all these boxes before we can guarantee funding. And so they end up creating more games with more propaganda, which then gets rejected. Then the next team that comes along, they have to check even more boxes because they now need to capture more gamers or, gamers. And so around, round and round and round it goes. And then we end up in the same situation that Hollywood is in now, which is slowly in decline. So it's sort of a snake eating its own tail, right? They create the problem, and the problem makes it a lot more difficult for good movies or good games to then be made. And then us, the fans or the consumers suffer for it because we see the problem, and you're screaming to say don't make this, but the people the people running these corporations, they're not as intelligent as you give them credit for. They aren't. So it is good that eh, Ex Voto has not performed well, and we can only hope that. And I, I I know people are trying to pit this against the next game. I believe is A Knight's Tale, and they're trying to pit one against the other. But I would caution you against doing that, right? I don't think there's any victory in making that comparison, right? Allow this to die and fade away. And as I've said before, we do need to, some level of gatekeeping is going to be necessary if it is that you hope to save these games, right? We cannot say it's okay. They just allow them to make whatever they want to make. No, because we're in one industry, and whatever happens here will have compounding effects in other areas. So you do have to say, no, no more of these games. No, this should not be injected. This LGBTQ stuff should not be injected in these games because the public perception of games have now reached levels that people now question everything that comes out, and rightfully so. Right? I can't blame them. But part of the reason why people are no longer as excited when a title is announced, especially a new IP, is because they've been burnt before. They've tried and they've realized that a lot of these a lot of this identity politics keep getting injected into the stories they consume, and so whenever something is announced, they look at it with skepticism and I'm not going to give this a chance, or I'm going to wait for this to hit streaming if it's a TV show or whatever, or I'm going to wait for this to go on sale if it's a video game because I don't want to pay full price for something that may end up disappointing me. The more you allow games like Ex Voto to be made, the more difficult it becomes for people to trust, new IP that are announced or game announcements. And then when that happens and sales are down, the studios compensate by trying to increase the pricing for the game. And then that now cuts the affordable games out, and people now can't afford games because they're now too expensive. So again, a snake eating its own tail. That is what happens when you don't gatekeep or you allow games like this to exist within the same space. You have to draw a line and say, no more. This does not belong here. This gaming is a male space. It always has been. We do not want this here. These stories, like this particular story for Ex Voto, I'm sure it exists in a novel somewhere. Women have already sort of ruined the publishing industry. And it's now filled with all the same fan fiction that you're seeing here in this game already exists in several novels. And so we need to, you've already ruined literature. Stay over there. At some point we do need to reclaim that space as well, because again, those are the stories that we're pulling from to make the games and the movies and the TV shows. So we do need to reclaim the literature space, right? That again, all of the great literature in existence, these are all been written by men, and we need to preserve that. But for the moment, this is a small victory. A small victory. I wouldn't celebrate because, again, as I said, there a lot of damage has been done to the gaming industry. So we're not at the point where we should really be celebrating. I would say the long war starts now.